refuse to wear a suit. Just want to see if you do you own a suit?
Yeah, problems.
While most presidents today are known for their distinctive policies and unique ways of speaking, Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, is known for something else entirely.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
Unlike most leaders with close ties to Western culture, President Zelenskyy never wears a suit, even when leaders from allied nations advise him to get one.
I will wear a costume after this war will finish.
Okay.
Yes.
Is this just a personal preference, or does it come from something much more important? Join us as we find out why the Ukrainian president never wears a suit.
We had a meeting again here in New York in September, and now there are a lot of challenges.
When Zelenskyy offended Trump. February 28th was perhaps the biggest and most recent moment that made the world wonder why the Ukrainian president never wears a suit. It was the day when Volodymyr Zelenskyy visited the White House to meet with United States President Donald Trump. This was a very important meeting as the lives of millions of soldiers were on the line. This meant every aspect of this meeting had to go perfectly. On top of that, Ukraine as a country was struggling in many ways at that time. One of their biggest nuclear power plants had just been destroyed, the Russian invasion was getting worse, and the country's economy was a huge mess. Ukraine needed a lot of help from the United States to make things right. And knowing how important the meeting was, the officials who welcomed Zelenskyy asked him to dress in a formal suit. But that was where the problem started. When he was asked to wear formal clothes, Volodymyr Zelenskyy chose not to do so, refusing to change his mind no matter how hard they tried to talk him out of it.
A lot of Americans have problems with you not respecting
I don't
the
have
authority of
such.
this office.
According to the reports, choosing not to dress formally felt offensive to Donald Trump. Instead of coming dressed in a suit like those who welcomed him advised, Zelenskyy arrived at the Oval Office wearing a custom black military-style shirt, a style of dressing that easily made him stand out from every other person in the formal setting. Because of this, things didn't go well from the moment they met in person. The awkward moment came right at the entrance to the West Wing, when President Trump greeted Zelenskyy with a sarcastic remark as they shook hands.
Great honor to have you with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. President.
"You are all dressed up today," he said right before they got inside to start the negotiations.
How are you? Pretty sure.
He's all dressed up today.
As we know, the discussion turned out to be a huge dumpster fire from the get-go, leading to an event some reporters called the worst fallout between two presidents in recent history. Things got even more awkward when Brian Glenn, a reporter from Real America's Voice, asked Zelenskyy during the meeting why he didn't wear a suit even though he was visiting the highest level of the country's office. Brian's question was put in a way that showed that a lot of Americans weren't comfortable with his dressing, as it implied that the Ukrainian president didn't have enough respect for the country he needed help from. In response, the Ukrainian president told Brian that he would put on a suit only when the war was over. To prevent further disrespect, President Trump chimed in by saying Zelenskyy's dressing was all right, even though it looked informal. But even though Trump said that he dressed beautifully, the media could not put it to rest, and the response was quick and decisive. Some saw his dressing as disrespectful, while others saw it as nothing to make a fuss about. Whichever side you pick, the question of why Zelenskyy didn't wear a suit to that meeting still lingers on. And though many answers have been given, none of them explains all the events that happened that day. Some believe he was trying to build an image. A few people think he was keeping up with some historical tradition, while others think he was trying to identify with the soldiers fighting at the front lines against the Russian invaders. Contrary to what most people think, the reason he refused to wear a suit goes far beyond personal choices or a dislike for Trump. It goes much deeper than that. As an example, what if we told you that wearing a suit would only make matters worse for the people fighting in Ukraine today? As crazy as that sounds, it is the truth as far as the soldiers are concerned. How can this be true? In this video, we will explore all the answers to that question and much more. So without further ado, let's get to it. The reasons behind the clothes. To understand the reasons behind Zelenskyy's dressing habits, we have to first understand the times he dressed in unique ways. If you've paid close attention to how he dresses in recent years, you'd find out that Zelenskyy has only appeared in military-inspired clothes from the period Russia invaded Ukraine. Before then, he wouldn't mind taking a suit along to any occasion where it's asked for. With this in mind, it's safe to say that Zelenskyy wears his casual military clothes as a way of respecting those fighting on the front lines. Right now, Ukraine is running low on soldiers and is now bringing in civilians with very little experience to join the fight. Because of this, a lot of these people haven't been trained enough on what to wear as a soldier, and forcing them to wear full gear isn't practical given the circumstances. The best they have to wear are casual shirts and jackets that allow them to move freely with the crest of Ukraine's military on the fabric. At this moment, President Zelenskyy isn't just a president, he is a wartime leader, and just as every decision a soldier makes on the front lines could either mean life or death, every choice he makes as president affects the lives of millions. With this in mind, he makes the deliberate choice of dressing as a civilian, now forced into the front lines, as a reminder to the people and himself of the difficult times they are in. Also, this wasn't a decision he made on his own. And how do we know this? Meet Elvira Gasanova. She was the Ukrainian fashion designer in charge of arranging Zelenskyy's wardrobe for the visit, and she had a lot to say about the backlash that came because of the way her president looked when he arrived at the Oval Office. In a remote and exclusive talk with Financial Times, Elvira made it clear that even though Zelenskyy wasn't a fan of Trump on a lot of things, his dressing had nothing to do with that. During the talk, she said that wearing suits during a time of war is not important. In times of war, politicians don't need suits. And as the president's fashion designer, she has always tried to provide clothes that symbolize what the country was going through at the time. Wearing a suit during a time of war is like wearing very colorful clothes during a funeral as far as she's concerned. With this in mind, she was more focused with providing clothes that looked good enough to wear, but not too formal for someone in a time of war. And that was how she arrived at the clothes the president wore to the Oval Office. To make sure it wasn't too casual, she added the trident symbol of Ukraine's independence on the left side of his chest, as you can see in this picture. Elvira believed that this would send the right message at the height of conflict with Russia. What she did not expect was the backlash that came right after, as this wasn't the first time the president wore these types of clothes to the United States. Still, it was a great explanation for what happened at the Oval Office. But was that the truth? To answer this question, let's go a few years back in time to the year 2021. There are many pictures from this period where Zelenskyy was seen wearing a suit both in and out of Ukraine for different events. As someone with a background in the entertainment industry, it's safe to say that his choice to wear casual, military-inspired clothes has nothing to do with his fashion taste. Back then, he wore suits on many occasions, including the day when he became president by taking the oath of office back in May 2019. But ever since the war started, he stopped appearing in suits for at least most of the time. Zelenskyy avoided suits so much that many were surprised to see him looking formal during his address to the United States General Assembly in September 2023. And he only did this because he couldn't take the risk of being misunderstood by the other world leaders who heard him speak. This means the only reason Zelenskyy was brave enough to dress more casually on February 28th was because it wasn't the first time he had done so. He had dressed casually on multiple occasions during his meetings with former President Joe Biden. And the big difference this time was that Donald Trump was not used to it, especially considering how his workers in charge of welcoming Zelenskyy had told him to wear a suit. The only other time in 2023 when he wore a suit was a few months earlier, in May, during his meeting with Pope Francis at the Vatican. Whether it was because of respect for the Catholic faith or just him giving in to cultural expectations is completely up in the air. But what these examples show us is that Zelenskyy is well aware of the context of every event he attends outside his country, and his reasons go far beyond his taste or level of respect for the countries he is visiting. Thanks to the reasons given by Elvira Gasanova and a brief look at the president's dressing pattern in recent years, we now have a good understanding of why he dresses the way he does. But while these show us the reasons behind the clothes, they don't give us the deeper message behind each of them. Even though Elvira's explanation makes sense on the surface, the reality is not every recruit on the battlefield dresses that way. And this fact alone raises many other questions. Think about it. If he wants to identify with soldiers, why not dress as a military commander or a war veteran with a suit wearing the stars and stripes of someone with a high rank? Unlike the generals and lieutenants in his army, President Zelenskyy is the country's sovereign commander-in-chief.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has announced he has sacked the commander-in-chief.
So why does it have to be casual and average when most leading soldiers don't dress that way? Well, what if we told you that his dressing in casual military clothes is doing more good during this time of war? How so, you might ask? the answers are quite surprising. Why he never wears a suit? In case you haven't noticed, aside from his recent meeting with President Trump, Zelenskyy has always worn olive green clothes during his visits to other nations. As far as Ukrainian tradition is concerned, this color signifies respect for the country's national defense and sovereignty. One notable time that showed this was during his visit to the United States in December 2022.
The United States Congress welcomed Zelenskyy with a 2-minute standing ovation on the House floor.
When he addressed the United States Congress with his olive green sweatshirt with the Ukrainian trident symbol on his chest. While many people either saw this as his normal looks or something that wasn't proper, it was a big deal to the people of Ukraine who watched the event. So encouraging that for a short time, it caused the war to turn in their favor. What made it so powerful was the trident symbol on his shirt. This symbol, commonly known in Ukraine as the trident, is not just the national symbol of Ukraine, but also has a very interesting history. You see, the story behind this symbol goes way back to the medieval state of Kievan Rus, an area that is now part of modern Ukraine. There it was used as a seal of approval by Grand Prince Volodymyr the Great from the year 980 AD. The reason it looks like a trident is that the medieval state had a very close partnership with the Vikings, a group of violent sailing warriors and traders from Scandinavia who explored and fought in many places. Thanks to their influence, the symbol was created as a piece of art inspired by the Norse rulers who used the same symbols on their banners and weapons. Later on, Volodymyr the Great began to stamp this symbol on silver coins so the entire state could use it as their main currency. As the months went by, Volodymyr's strategy turned out to be a good idea, as it boosted the region's economy for over 200 years until the Mongol Empire invaded. Even though the Mongols tried their best to change the cultures and traditions of the native people, they kept that symbol sacred as much as they could to preserve their tradition, and that's how the trident symbol has remained important throughout the ages. This sacred symbol was what inspired them to fight and achieve their independence in 1991, helped them through the Orange Revolution of the early 2000s, and also inspired the Euromaidan protests in 2013, up until the moment President Zelenskyy wore the symbol during his meeting with the US Congress back in 2022. It was a sign that showed the world that Ukraine's long fight for complete independence is nothing new. Beyond that, it showed everyone that Ukraine was ready to keep fighting till the bitter end, with or without help from other nations. For the soldiers and civilians seeing this, it was all the encouragement they needed to keep fighting. So much so that it caused the war to swing in their favor, even though it was for a short time. Besides that, let's face it, President Zelenskyy isn't the first person to take this approach to leadership and diplomacy. A brief look at history shows us that many historical figures helped with a lot of problems just by the way they looked in public. For example, Winston Churchill was a famous leader from Britain who helped the Allied nations defeat the German troops during the Second Global Conflict. He worked with the most beloved figures in American history, like Franklin Roosevelt, to win the war and keep peace in the world. He also won a Nobel Prize for his books and was admired by many people across the world for decades. Now guess what he wore most of the time, even during important meetings with major world leaders? That's right, an old siren dress that almost looked like a boiler suit. As strange as it looked to a lot of people, this felt important to Winston Churchill because he wanted to show the world that he was always ready to work alongside citizens during the most difficult times, especially during air raids. This style of leading was also seen in India's most popular lawyer, Mahatma Gandhi. This was a man who helped his country gain independence from Britain in the late 40s with as little violence as possible. His peaceful approach to handling problems and unique take on human value inspired civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela. And just like Winston Churchill, he too wasn't a fan of dressing formally in public places all the time. Even though he was rich and appeared in many places, with the wealthiest and most powerful men in his country, Gandhi always wore a simple dhoti attire to align himself more with the common people.
And just behind her comes Mr. Gandhi, dressed as he said he would be, in just his loincloth.
It is also important to know that most of Zelenskyy's casual clothes are made by a military brand called MTAC, a Ukrainian company that makes tactical outfits for the armed forces. This leads us to the big question about his fashion choices. If he has a military brand that is capable of making casual clothes for civilian recruits and high-grade suits for wartime leaders, why does it always have to be the casual ones for the president? As far as he's concerned, the answer isn't that simple, so let's break it down together. On the surface, wearing a suit with the stars and stripes of the military sounds like a good idea. After all, it shows a strong sign of being a powerful wartime leader. The huge problem is that the suit also represents a long distance from the daily struggles of war. It isn't something someone on the front lines would wear, and history shows us various examples of how this could easily grow into a bigger problem. Many leaders and politicians in the past have worn suits with medals and insignias to show their rank and achievements. And while this commands a lot of respect, it also creates a separation between the people and their leader. It shows the high rank of the person wearing it, thereby making the leader stand above rather than living among the people he is leading. Unlike Ukraine, the foundation of the American military was set to improve the existing power system and boost respect and discipline among soldiers. Ukraine's situation is much different. Most of their history shows a nation that is fighting for survival and identity, not trying to improve respect and discipline among soldiers. Their history, tracing back to Prince Volodymyr the Great, tells of a region that is more focused on cultural pride and independence, rather than improving the power system of an existing military. We know this because of what happened during the Soviet era. Russia had taken away the country's national symbols and was forced to adopt those of the USSR. When they gained independence in 1991, they used the symbol to establish an identity. That is an achievement a suit with generic insignias cannot achieve, because the trident's return that year was not simply a design choice, but a symbol of pride and identity. Beyond popular heroes like Winston and Mahatma Gandhi, history also tells of many rebels and wartime leaders whose choice to wear casual clothes changed the course of the past. Their stories were mind-blowing, as we shall see, when simple fashion choices changed history. Among the craziest stories of how simple fashion choices changed the course of history happened during the American Revolution, a time when 13 powerful colonies fought for complete freedom from their British colonizers. The native colonies were angry that the invaders had made unfair taxes and laws without letting them have their say. And among the leaders of this war was the famous George Washington. At the start of the war, he dressed in British-style military uniforms. But as the war went on, he went for a more practical and simplified look to match the reality of the war. The reality being that George was fighting against powerful invaders whose leaders wore clothes that were similar to his, clothes that most soldiers on his side couldn't afford. To boost their morale, George and several other leaders on his side switched to the more casual clothes the natives wore, and it worked. Almost 20 years after the difficult battles of Lexington and Concord, the colonizers gained independence, and the United States of America was born in 1783. Another great example of this was Fidel Castro, a powerful leader who overthrew the wicked Fulgencio Batista through the Cuban Revolution and ruled for almost 50 years. Though the battles he fought were legendary, historians tell us that his biggest achievement was gaining the support of the discouraged Cuban people. He did this by always dressing as a soldier instead of a formal leader, with all the wits and charisma that was needed to lead the revolution. By dressing like the average person and fighting alongside them, Castro was able to win their trust and loyalty. So much so that thousands of men laid down their lives to make sure his ambition came true. He always rejected elite military suits and preferred to fight with the people, not rule over them during difficult times. Like these people, it's safe to say that Zelenskyy, with his casual clothes made by the military, is making a statement to everyone that Ukraine is not an established nation at the moment, but a small group of people trying to defend their home. That is why he always tries to stand out from other leaders, especially at a time like this. As far as he knows, stars and stripes on a suit only follow the old traditions, but wearing the trident symbol on a simple sweatshirt represents much more. Interestingly enough, Zelenskyy has also worn traditional clothes during important national celebrations in Ukraine, and a great example of this happened last year with the Vyshyvanka Day celebrations.
Employees of the Verkhovna Rada also joined celebrations on the occasion of Vyshyvanka Day. In the courtyard of Parliament, they formed a trident.
On that day, President Zelenskyy and his wife wore traditional clothes for the entire day, and many interpreted it as his way of resisting the cultural changes the Russian invaders would bring if they took over the region. But let's assume President Volodymyr Zelenskyy decides to stop doing his own thing and follow the culture of other nations he visits. Like most people, you might be wondering what the harm would be. What could go wrong? After all, he's been seen wearing a suit on multiple occasions, so making it a habit wouldn't be much of a surprise. It would also be a good sign that he respects other nations when their leaders choose to dress formally whenever they decide to meet. There is no harm in that, right? Wrong. Contrary to what you might think, there would be a lot of consequences that would occur if President Zelenskyy changes his wardrobe at a time like this. And in case you are wondering what the harm is, stay until the end as we uncover the complete truth. What would happen if he changes his mind? So what would happen if President Zelenskyy suddenly decided to start wearing suits all the time to gain favor from other nations like the United States? A lot of things, mostly bad. First off, it would send the wrong message that would harm the country's image, morale, and leadership in many ways. For someone in his position, clothes aren't just fabrics, they carry meaning, especially in a place like the East. Right now, his choice to wear simple clothes shows that he understands what the civilians are going through and is always part of the fight for the country's survival. He has done this for over 3 years, and the rest of the world and his people have known him for that. Suddenly deciding to stop doing that would only create chaos and confusion by sending a whole different message. One that implies that he has given up on upholding the country's needs and is more focused on gaining favor from outside nations. And that alone would destroy the very unity and trust he has built. He wouldn't be the first person to make this kind of mistake, as many past stories tell about the roles of clothing and how leaders are treated by their people and the outside world. As crazy as it sounds, there were several times in the past when famous leaders changed their wardrobes to look more formal, and the results were quick and devastating. One example of this was Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. Before the revolution kicked off, he always wore casual military clothes to show how proud he was of his army. But when things started falling apart, he switched to wearing fine suits and attires while his country suffered. Slowly but surely, the people began to hate him as he grew disconnected because of how different he looked. And it didn't take long before he and his entire family were executed by the rebels. The same thing happened with Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran. In his early years, he always wore traditional clothes that people were familiar with. But as the tensions grew with invaders, he switched to wearing Western clothes to reduce tensions while the people he led were struggling with various economic and financial troubles. Without knowing it, his expensive suits became the symbol of corruption, making it easier for the rebels to gain support from the normal folks to overthrow him. In 1979, during the famous Iranian Revolution, after years of endless struggle, Mohammad Pahlavi was overthrown, and the Iranian Revolution was complete. Like these fallen leaders of the past, Zelenskyy wearing a suit right now at a time when Ukraine is barely holding its own would create many similar problems, causing many to think he's shifting away from the reality of war. Right now, the soldiers on the front lines look to him as a leader who understands their pain. And one of the reasons they trust him at a time like this is because he always looks like someone who is a part of the struggle. Even beyond his people, the world is also starting to understand why he always dresses that way. Whenever he visits world leaders during international meetings, his clothing is a reminder of war. It constantly tells the world that the country is still fighting. They still need help, and this is not the time for needless formalities and luxury. Switching to suits would make supporting countries question whether Ukraine is really in as much danger as they make it out to be, reducing the level of urgency that is needed at such a hard time. Let's not forget that Russia also keeps an eye on him. The general narrative is that he is an actor who only cares about getting along with the United States. Changing his wardrobe at a time like this would prove them right, even with the best intentions, giving Vladimir Putin an advantage in shaping the ongoing narrative that makes Ukraine lose its focus and unity. The psychological impact on soldiers and civilians would be very significant. For the soldiers, wearing a suit while visiting war zones in damaged cities as part of his work would only make stand out rather than helping him connect with them. And for the civilians, most of them have lost homes and properties to the war. So seeing the president look so differently during public talks would make him look bad by all metrics. And that is a crisis the country cannot afford. In the end, a suit is not just clothing, but a statement that sends a message. And wearing a suit right now would only send the wrong one. This is why the Ukrainian president never wears a suit. Is there something we've missed? Let us know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Also, click on the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.